The boiler in the east wing of Carver Elementary had been broken since October. It was now the second week of February, and the children in room 14 still wore their coats during first period. The principal had taped a handwritten note to the thermostat that read, "Please be patient, repairs pending funding review," as if patience was something you could tape to a wall and have it warm a room full of 9-year-olds. Margaret Chen had stopped being patient about things like that a long time ago. She'd been teaching 4th grade at Carver for 11 years. In the same classroom with the same peeling corner of ceiling tile above the reading rug and the same radiator that knocked every morning at 6:45 like an old neighbor reminding her she was here, she was needed, this was her place. She brought her own space heater from home. She brought two, eventually one for her desk. One for the reading corner where the kids who came in before the bell would sit because some of them didn't have anywhere warm to go before school started. Margaret made $38,000 a year. She spent about $4,000 of it on her classroom. She didn't talk about that, she didn't post about it. She kept a mason jar of sharpened pencils on every table group because she'd noticed years ago that children who had to stop and search for a pencil lost the thread of what they were thinking, and when you lost the thread at 9 years old in a school that was already running out of everything, sometimes you never found it again. She wasn't going to let that happen, not in room 14. The children knew, children always know. There was a boy named Darius who had come to her class in October, mid-semester. Transferred from a school across town after his mother moved them into his grandmother's apartment. He didn't speak for the first 2 weeks, just sat near the back, watching everything with eyes that had already seen too much. Margaret didn't push him. She put a copy of a book about a boy who builds rockets in his grandmother's backyard on his desk one morning and didn't say a word about it. On the 3rd week, Darius raised his hand during science and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he thought the experiment was wrong because the control variable wasn't actually being controlled. He was correct. Margaret told him so in front of everyone, clearly and without fuss, and Darius straightened in his chair like something was being poured back into him. There was a girl named Sophia, whose parents worked nights, who sometimes fell asleep at her desk during morning reading. Margaret never woke her with embarrassment. She'd quietly move the other children to the carpet and let Sophia sleep for 10 minutes, and when she woke up, there would be a cup of apple juice on her desk and nobody looking at her sideways, because Margaret had already handled that too. There was Marcus, whose ZEEP had been filed incorrectly for 2 years before Margaret caught it. She'd spent 3 evenings on the phone with district offices, then another evening with his mother at the kitchen table going over everything in plain language, not educational jargon. Just here is what your son needs and here is how we are going to make sure he gets it. This is who she was, this is what she did, and none of it appeared in any metric that mattered to a man like Garrett Holt. Garrett Holt was 54 years old, worth approximately $900 million, and had recently made a significant donation to the Carver Educational Trust, the private organization that now provided nearly 40% of Carver Elementary's operating budget. He had a foundation. The foundation had a logo. The logo appeared on the marquee outside the school and on the letterhead of every communication the principal sent home, and on the banner above the gymnasium stage where the kids did their winter performances. Garrett Holt had not set foot inside a classroom since 1986, but he had a team. The team had standards. The standards included a clause in the funding agreement that said, in language precise enough to be lawyered but vague enough to be weaponized, that any staff member whose conduct created organizational disruption or reputational risk could be removed at the discretion of the trust, pending review. The principal, a careful man named Robert Alcott, who needed that 40% to keep the lights on literally because the electrical system was also under review, had shown that clause to exactly nobody on his teaching staff. Margaret didn't know about the clause. What she knew was this: on the second Thursday of February, she had sent a letter home with every child in her class explaining that the upcoming standardized test, the one the district was preparing them for with 3 weeks of drilling and scripted lessons and packets that all looked the same and had nothing to do with anything real, was not the only measure of their intelligence or their worth, and that she would be continuing to use the test preparation materials as required but would also be supplementing them with her own materials. because she believed her students deserved to be thought of as full human beings and not data points. It was a kind letter, it was honest. A few parents had emailed to thank her. One parent had forwarded the email to a board member of the Garrett Holt Educational Trust. The board member had forwarded it to Garrett Holt with the subject line, "Teacher actively undermining standardized assessment framework, your thoughts?" Garrett Holt's thoughts took approximately 4 minutes. He forwarded it to his operations director with a single line, "This needs to be addressed. We cannot have staff in foundation-funded schools communicating directly with parents in ways that conflict with our assessment goals. Please coordinate with principal." He had a 9 o'clock call after that. He barely thought about it again. Margaret was in the middle of a lesson on fractions, real fractions, using strips of paper. They'd cut themselves because she dreaded the research on manipulatives and believed it, and because paper cost almost nothing when Robert Alcott appeared in the window of her classroom door. He had the look of a man who had been asked to do something he found deeply uncomfortable and had decided the only way through it was to do it quickly. He knocked once and came in. He told her there was a situation. He told her she would need to come with him. He told her with an apology in his eyes that his mouth didn't quite manage. That it would be better if she didn't make a scene. She asked him what kind of situation. He said he'd explain in the hallway. In the hallway, he explained that the trust had concerns. That her letter had been flagged, that until the situation was reviewed, she was being asked to leave the premises for the day, effective immediately. Margaret Chen was quiet for a long moment. The hallway smelled like floor wax and lunch being prepared 3 rooms away and the particular brand of industrial soap the custodians used. "On Thursdays," she said, "I have 22 children in that room." Robert said someone would cover. He said it was just for the day. He said he was sorry. She didn't yell. She didn't cry, though the pressure behind her eyes was enormous. She just stood there for a moment, holding the fraction strips she'd been carrying when he came in, thin pale ribbons of paper in her hands, and she thought about Darius and his rocket book and Sophia and her 10 minutes of sleep and Marcus and the phone calls, all those evenings on the phone, and she thought, "I am not a liability, I am the reason half these kids come to school." But she thought about Robert too. She thought about the 40%. She said, "Give me a minute to say goodbye to my class." He hesitated. Then he nodded. She went back to room 14. She told them calmly that she had to step out for the afternoon, that someone would be in to finish the lesson. She smiled at them, the way you smile when you're trying to give someone your steadiness as a gift. She told them to keep working on their fractions. She picked up her bag from behind her desk. She took the small framed photograph of her mother from the corner of her desk and put it in her bag. That was the moment several of them understood that something was wrong. Darius watched the photograph go into the bag. His face went still and careful the way it had been in October when he first arrived. Sophia sat up very straight. Marcus looked from Margaret to the door and back again. Margaret walked into the hallway. She didn't get far. Behind her, the door to room 14 opened. It was Darius. He stood in the doorway of room 14 with his fraction strips still in his hands, and he looked at the security guard who had appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall, uncomfortable young man named Derek who had been told to escort a teacher off the premises and had not been told why, and Darius said, in that voice that was still sometimes barely above a whisper, "Where is she going?" Robert said, "Please go back to your classroom." Darius didn't move, and then Sophia appeared behind him, and then Marcus, and then, one by one, like a slow tide coming in, the rest of room 14 filed into the hallway and stood there, 22 children in their winter coats, holding their fraction strips and their pencils, and one of them still holding the book he'd been reading, his finger tucked inside to keep the page. They weren't loud, they weren't threatening, they were just there. Robert said, "Please, everyone go back inside. This is a grown-up matter and everything is fine." A girl named Priya, who had the kind of serious, clear eyes that made adults feel they'd been understood completely, said, "If everything is fine, why does she have her mom's picture in her bag?" Nobody had an answer for that. A boy named Trevor, who had repeated third grade and whom Margaret had tutored on Tuesday afternoons for 6 months, said, "She stayed after school every week with me even when it was snowing. She never asked for anything." A girl named Dahlia said, "She called my grandma when I had that bad week. She didn't have to do that." Another child. Then another. Not a mob, not chaos, just children saying true things in the hallway of their school with the fluorescent lights buzzing above them and the smell of Thursday soup drifting down the corridor. Derek, the security guard, had stopped moving. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the ceiling and then looked at his shoes and did not move to escort anyone anywhere. At the far end of the hallway, in the doorway that led to the administrative wing, Garrett Holt stood in a $2,000 coat and watched. He had stopped by to speak with Robert about the funding review. He had not expected any of this. He watched a 9-year-old girl in a puffy pink jacket say, with complete earnestness, that Miss Chen had found out her library card was expired and had driven her to the public library on a Saturday to get a new one because she wanted to be able to check out books over spring break. Garrett Holt had started 3 companies. He had sat in boardrooms where decisions were made that changed the shape of entire industries. He understood leverage and risk and reputational calculus. He thought of himself as someone who did not make decisions carelessly. He watched a boy who looked like he had learned early not to expect much from the world take one small, stubborn step forward in the direction of his teacher and say, "She is the reason I am not afraid of this place anymore." "And you're treating her like she did something wrong." Something shifted in Garrett Holt. It moved slowly, the way ice moves under pressure over time, but irreversibly. He had forwarded that email in 4 minutes. He had not read the letter Margaret had written. He had responded to a summary of it, a summary written by someone trying to protect a funding metric, and he had told them to handle it, and this was what handling it looked like: a woman in a hallway holding her mother's photograph in her bag while children stood between her and the door. He walked forward, down the hallway, past the hand-painted student artwork on the walls, the paper planets turning on strings above the trophy case, the photograph of last year's third-grade class where every child was grinning with the unself-conscious joy of the 8-year-old who does not yet know the world will ask them to manage their enthusiasm. He stopped a few feet from the group. Margaret looked at him. He had expected her to look afraid or angry, the way people usually looked when they recognized him in a room that had power in it. She didn't look either thing. She looked tired and sad and resolute. The way someone looks when they have decided to hold on to who they are even though it is costing them something. He said, "I'd like to hear from you, if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wrote those parents because I know these children. I know what they need, and what they need is to believe that they are more than their test scores." He said, "I read the summary of your letter." She said, "Did you read the letter?" He hadn't. He knew he hadn't. She reached into her bag, the same bag that held her mother's photograph, and she took out a folded piece of paper. She always kept a copy, and she held it out to him. He took it, he read it. It took him 4 minutes, the same amount of time it had taken to forward the email that started all of this. But this 4 minutes felt different. He read about children who were trying and about the importance of letting them know that trying mattered apart from outcomes, and about the way test pressure could feel to a 9-year-old who was already carrying a lot, like one more way to fail. He folded the paper carefully. He looked at the children. He looked at Derek, who was still studying his shoes. He looked at Robert, who had the expression of a man who had genuinely done his best in an impossible situation. He said, "I think I made a fast decision based on incomplete information." No one spoke. He said, "I'd like to hear more about what you're doing here. Not today. Has been enough, but I'd like to hear more, if you're willing to talk to me." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to decide whether this was real, whether people like this actually changed their minds in hallways in front of children, or whether this was performance, something to manage the scene. Darius, standing just behind her and slightly to the left in the way that children take up their positions near the people they trust, said quietly, "She'll talk to you. She talks to everyone. That's kind of her whole thing." Several of the children laughed softly. Even Margaret. Even after a moment, Garrett Holt, he said to Robert, She goes back to her classroom today and every day until there's been a full and proper review, and I mean a review that actually looks at what she does. Not a summary of what someone didn't like about an email. Robert nodded. He looked relieved in a way that was almost painful to see. Margaret stood in the hallway for one more moment, then she turned to her class, 22 children in their coats, with their fraction strips, in their school that was cold and underfunded and still. Somehow growing things, she said. Let's go finish our lesson, and they went, that afternoon, as Margaret stood at the whiteboard explaining that a fraction was just a way of saying how much of something you had when you didn't have all of it. She thought about what had happened in the hallway. She thought about how she had been prepared to leave. She had made her peace with it, the way you make peace with unfair things because you have learned that some battles break you without changing anything. She had not expected 22 children to decide otherwise. Garrett Holt spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in an empty classroom down the hall with permission, at his own quiet request reading the letter 3 more times. And then going online and reading studies about student well-being and test anxiety and the documented effects of teacher retention on long-term student outcomes, things he had never bothered to read because he had people for that, except his people had been optimizing for different numbers. He increased the trust's funding to Carver. By 30%, he earmarked a portion specifically for teacher retention and classroom supplies. He added a line to the trustees' funding agreement that required any staffing decisions in foundation-funded schools to go through a full review process. That included teacher input and student outcome data of the kind that couldn't be summarized in a single email. He visited room 14 once more in March, when the boiler had finally been fixed and the coat hooks in the hallway were full of children who no longer needed them inside. Margaret introduced him to her class as a person who was learning the same as all of them. Darius looked at him with those careful, appraising eyes and said, "What are you learning?" Garrett said, without hesitating, that the most important things in a room usually don't show up on a spreadsheet. Darius thought about that for a moment, then he nodded once as though filing it in some internal place where he kept the things adults said that turned out to actually be true. Margaret Chen got a small raise that spring, not enough, never quite enough, but she bought a third space heater for the corner by the window where it was always coldest, and she put a new framed photograph of her mother on her desk, a better photograph, one where her mother was laughing, and every morning, 6:45, the old radiator knocked. She was here, she was needed, this was her place. Some things you don't walk away from, and sometimes when you are ready to anyway, when the thing you love has cost you more than it should and the people with the power have forgotten that power is just a tool and tools can do great harm when handled without care, sometimes the smallest people in the room will stand up and show everyone in it what it looks like to refuse to let something good be lost, not because they were told to, not because it was safe or easy or strategically wise, because she had showed up for them every day without asking for anything. She had showed up. And when the moment came, when the hallway stretched long and cold and the door was just ahead of her, they showed up too. That is what goodness does. It moves through people like heat through a room, quietly, without announcement, until one day, in a hallway that smells like floor wax and Thursday soup, you discover that it has been there all along and that it does not leave without a fight. Leadership is not a title or a donation. It is the willingness to pause when wrong, to listen when listening costs you something. To look at a woman holding her Mother-E's photograph and understand that her paycheck tells you nothing about what she carries. Dignity, the kind no checkbook can grant or revoke, looks like a woman who does not raise her voice when she has every right to. It looks like choosing, again and again, to believe children deserve more and then giving it yourself because no one else was going to. We remember the teachers who saw us. Long after the scores are gone, we remember the ones who stayed late, who made the call, who put the book on the desk without making a thing of it. We remember. And sometimes, when it matters most, we stand up. That is the whole lesson.